The dust was the first thief. It stole the green from the fields, the water from the creek, and the hope from my mother's eyes. After it took my father, it came for the rest of us, slow and silent, settling in a fine brown sheet over everything we owned, everything we were. My name is Jacob, and back then, I was just a boy of 10, with a cough that rattled the floorboards in our little cabin. But I was old enough to know the sound of an empty pantry. It's a hollow, quiet sound, the kind of silence that eats everything else. My mother, Elara, would stand before the bare shelves, her hand resting on the smooth, worn wood where sacks of flour and sugar used to sit. She'd say nothing, but I could hear her heart breaking. She had one thing left of value, one thing the dust and the debt couldn't touch, a thin gold band on her left hand. My father, Thomas, had placed it there on their wedding day. It was the last piece of him she had. And one morning, as my cough grew worse, I watched her slide it from her finger. The decision cost her everything. But the silence in the pantry was louder than the screaming in her soul. She walked through town with her head held high. Though I know it felt like a walk of shame, every curtain seemed to twitch as she passed. Every pair of eyes felt like an accusation. They all knew. In a town as small as ours, secrets were a luxury we couldn't afford. They knew her husband was gone. They knew her credit at Gable's Mercantile had run dry. Mr. Gable himself, a man with a face like a clenched fist, had told her so himself just last week. "Sympathy don't fill my ledger, Alara," he'd said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a nail in a coffin. Her destination was the one place no one went unless they had to, the Blackwood Ranch. It sat on the edge of town, a place of stark fences and hard-packed earth. It was run by a man who was more myth than neighbor, Silas Blackwood. People said he was a hard man, a cold man. He'd come here a decade ago with a herd of cattle and a silence as vast as the plains. He never came to town socials. He never spoke more than a handful of words at a time. He just worked, his shadow long and lonely in the setting sun. But he had what we needed. His storehouse was always full, a fortress against the hunger that gnawed at the rest of us. My mother clutched the ring in her hand, the metal growing warm against her skin. It was a tiny piece of gold against a mountain of a man, a whisper against a wall of silence. She was walking toward the only man in the county who could help her, and the only one she was sure wouldn't. The wind kicked up dust around her ankles as if trying to pull her back, to warn her. But she kept walking. The sound of my coughing echoed in her ears, a drumbeat driving her forward. She found him by the corral, mending a fence post with methodical, powerful strikes of a hammer. Silas Blackwood was bigger in person. His shoulders were a yoke of muscle, his face a road map of sun and wind. He didn't seem to notice her at first, or maybe he was just pretending not to. He just kept hammering, the sound sharp and final in the quiet air. My mother waited. She stood there, a small, proud woman in a faded dress, until the silence became a question he had to answer. He finally stopped, turning his head just enough to look at her from the corner of his eye. His eyes were gray, like stones at the bottom of a river. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. He said nothing. He just waited, his gaze unwavering. She opened her palm. The gold ring lay there, a tiny circle of sunlight in the dirt and grime of her hand. It looked fragile, breakable. "I need flour," she said, her voice cracking on the last word. "For my boy. He's sick. This is all I have." The whole world seemed to hold its breath. The wind died down. The birds went silent. It was just the three of them. A desperate mother, a silent cattleman, and the ghost of a husband held in a tiny gold band. Silas Blackwood looked from the ring to my mother's face. His expression didn't change. There was no pity, no kindness, not even a flicker of curiosity. For a long moment, he just stared. She thought he might be weighing the gold, calculating its worth against a sack of flour. The thought made her stomach clench with shame. Then he moved, a single, sharp motion. He shook his head, just once. It wasn't a gesture of sympathy. It was a dismissal. Clean, cold, and absolute. He turned his back on her, picked up his hammer, and struck the fence post again. The sharp crack echoed the shattering of her last hope. He didn't offer a reason. He didn't offer a word of apology. He just erased her. He went back to his work as if she had never been there, as if a woman hadn't just offered up the last remnant of her heart for a handful of dust. Humiliation burned hotter than any sun. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall on his land. She turned and fled, the sound of his hammer blows chasing her all the way back to our empty cabin, each strike a nail in her coffin. She didn't just feel rejected, she felt worthless. She stumbled back into our home, the gold ring now feeling like a lead weight on her finger. She had put it back on without thinking, a reflex of a woman clinging to the life she once had. I was awake, my breathing shallow. She looked at me, and the lie she had to tell was the cruelest cut of all. "It's all right, Jacob," she whispered, her voice a raw thing. "Everything is going to be all right." She sat in the dark that night, long after I'd fallen into a fitful sleep. She held her hand to her chest, the ring a cold knot against her skin. She had failed me. She had failed my father. She had offered up his memory for barter and had it thrown back in her face. The silence of the house was a living thing, a predator stalking the last of her strength. She had nothing left, no plan, no hope, just the dust and the dark. And then came the morning. It was a sound that woke her, a soft thud from the pantry. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. We had nothing to steal. Had a vagrant broken in looking for scraps? She crept out of bed, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were fierce. No one was going to threaten her boy. She eased the bedroom door open. The main room was empty, bathed in the pale gray light of dawn. The pantry door, which she always kept tightly shut to hide the shame of its emptiness, was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness in the wall. She took a deep breath and pushed it open, and the world tilted on its axis. It was full. The shelves weren't just full, they were overflowing. Sacks of flour, 2 of them, fat and white, bags of beans and rice, tins of coffee, a thick slab of bacon wrapped in butcher paper, jars of peaches and preserves, glowing like jewels in the dim light. It was more food than we had seen in a year. It was a feast, a miracle. My mother stood there, poker still in hand, unable to process what she was seeing. She reached out a trembling hand and touched a sack of flour. It was real, solid. She squeezed her eyes shut and opened them again. The food was still there. Who? How? There was no note, no sign of a forced entry. It was as if the pantry had simply refilled itself by magic. She checked on me. I was still asleep, my breath rattling in my chest. She searched the cabin, her heart a wild drum. The windows were latched. The door was barred from the inside just as she had left it. It made no sense. Was this a dream? Was she losing her mind to grief and hunger? But the smell of coffee and cured meat was undeniable. The weight of the flour sack was real. Relief washed over her, so powerful it buckled her knees. We were safe. We would eat. But right behind the relief came a cold, creeping dread. This wasn't magic. Someone had done this. Someone had been in our house while we slept. The food wasn't a gift from heaven. It was a debt to a stranger, and she had no idea how she was going to pay it. Word of the miracle pantry spread through town faster than a prairie fire. It started with Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, who saw my mother buying a small tin of milk, the one thing the benefactor hadn't left. Mrs. Gable's eyes, small and sharp, had noted my mother's lack of desperation. She'd asked a few pointed questions, and from there, the story grew wings. The town's pity, which had always been a thin and brittle thing, curdled into suspicion. Whispers followed my mother like stray dogs. A secret benefactor, they'd say, their voices dripping with insinuation. The men would look at her with a new, unwelcome curiosity. The women would pull their children closer, their faces tight with judgment. The full pantry, which should have been our salvation, became a cage. The food tasted of shame. Every meal felt like we were eating a lie. My mother stopped going into town unless it was absolutely necessary. The 4 walls of our cabin, once a shelter, now felt like a prison. The miracle had made us outcasts. Then Sheriff Miller came to call. He was a good man, for the most part, but he was a man who listened to the wind. and the wind in town was blowing hard against us. He stood on our porch, turning his hat over and over in his hands, unable to meet my mother's eyes. "Elara," he began, his voice low. "Folks are talking." "I'm aware, Sheriff," she said, her voice like ice. "Just need to ask a few questions," he said, finally looking up. "The supplies, where did they come from?" "I don't know," she said. It was the truth, but it sounded like a lie even to her own ears. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. "Silas Blackwood reported a theft 2 nights ago from his storehouse. Flour, bacon, preserves, matches the description of, well, of your pantry." My mother's blood ran cold. Silas. It had to be him. He had refused her ring, refused her dignity, but then snuck onto her property like a thief in the night. Was this his idea of charity? A cruel joke to make her beholden to him, to make the whole town think the worst of her? Or was it something else? The sheriff wasn't accusing her. Not directly, but the question hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Was she the thief's accomplice? Had she sold more than just her pride to fill her pantry? He was leaving her to twist in the wind, to be judged by the court of public opinion. When he left, my mother was shaking, but it wasn't with fear. It was with rage, a pure, white-hot anger that burned away the shame and the helplessness. She had been wronged, first by Silas's cold rejection, and now by this calculated act of ruinous charity. He hadn't just given her food, he had given her a reputation she could never escape. She wouldn't have it. She marched out of the cabin, leaving me with a bowl of stew and a stern warning not to open the door for anyone. She walked the long, dusty road back to the Blackwood Ranch. There was no hesitation in her step this time. There was only fire. He was in the same spot by the corral, checking the latch on the gate. He looked up as she approached, his face a mask of indifference, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Or was it guilt? "You," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "You did this." Silas straightened up to his full height. He looked down at her, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "I don't know what you're talking about, ma'am." "Don't you lie to me," she cried, taking a step closer. "The food in my pantry, the theft you reported to the sheriff. You did it to shame me, to make everyone in town think that I'm your charity case, or worse." For the first time, a genuine emotion crossed Silas Blackwood's face. It was confusion. Deep, honest confusion. It was so real it stopped my mother's tirade cold. "Ma'am," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, like he was choosing each word with care. "I reported a theft because I was robbed. Someone cut the lock on my storehouse and took a good portion of my winter supplies. I don't know anything about your pantry." His denial was absolute. There was no lie in his eyes, just the cold, hard truth. He believed every word he was saying, and my mother believed him. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a fear more profound than anything she had felt before. If Silas hadn't filled the pantry, who had? And if the food in her house was stolen, then she was living on borrowed time. The real thief was still out there, and they had chosen her cabin as their hiding place. The food wasn't a gift. It wasn't a cruel joke. It was a trap. My mother returned home, the dust on the road feeling heavier, the sky darker. The food in the pantry no longer looked like a miracle. It looked like evidence. Every sack of flour, every jar of peaches was a link in a chain that was wrapping itself around her neck. She had to find a clue, something that would point to the real thief. She started with the flour sacks. They were plain burlap, with no markings from a miller or a mercantile. She emptied one of them into our flour bin, her hands sifting through the fine white powder, searching for anything that didn't belong. And then she found it. At the very bottom of the sack, nestled in the last handful of flour, was a small object. It was a piece of wood, no bigger than her thumb. It had been carved into the shape of a bird. The work was rough, a little crooked, but the shape was unmistakable. A whittled sparrow, its head cocked to one side as if listening. She had never seen anything like it. It wasn't something a person would lose by accident. It felt deliberate, a signature, a message. But what did it mean? She knew she couldn't go to the sheriff. What would she say? I found a wooden bird in a sack of stolen flour that appeared mysteriously in my pantry. He'd think she was crazy. No, she was on her own. She had to be careful. She had to be smart. She slipped the little bird into her apron pocket and went to see the one person in town who knew all the old stories. Martha, the seamstress. Martha was ancient, her face a web of wrinkles, but her memory was as sharp as her needles. My mother found her on her porch, mending a pair of trousers. She made small talk first, asking about Martha's rheumatism, commenting on the dry weather. Then casually she took the bird from her pocket. Martha, have you ever seen a carving like this? Martha put on her spectacles and took the bird, turning it over in her gnarled fingers. She squinted. Hmm, can't say I have, not recently. She paused, her eyes looking far away into the past. But it does. It reminds me of something. Years ago. What is it? My mother pressed gently. There was a boy, Martha said, her voice dropping to a whisper. A drifter. Name of Caleb. He was a sweet talker, handsome as a devil, but he had sticky fingers. And he was always whittling. Made little things like this for all the girls. Birds, mostly. A knot of ice formed in my mother's stomach. What happened to him? He fell hard for Silas Blackwood's sister, Lily, Martha said, her eyes darting around as if telling a forbidden secret. A sweet, frail girl. Silas didn't approve. Not one bit. Caleb was bad news and Silas knew it. Then Lily died. Died how? Of fever, they said. Took her quick. Caleb went wild with grief. He blamed Silas. Said Silas was too cheap to call a real doctor from the city. He swore he'd get his revenge. Caused a whole mess of trouble before Sheriff Miller's predecessor ran him out of town on a rail. Haven't seen him since. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of pure malice. Caleb, the drifter with a grudge. He must have come back. But he wasn't just after Silas. He was using my mother as a pawn in his twisted game of revenge. He stole the supplies from Silas, the man he hated. Then he planted them in the pantry of a desperate widow, the most vulnerable person in town. He knew word would get out. He knew the sheriff would connect the theft to the miracle. He was framing them both. He wanted to destroy Silas's reputation by making it look like he was either a thief himself or entangled with a fallen woman. And he wanted to destroy my mother by making her an outcast, a pariah. The wooden bird wasn't a clue. It was a message for her, a way of saying, I know who you are. I chose you. The generosity that had saved us was a lie. It was an act of pure, calculated hatred. And the man behind it was a ghost from the past, a man with a score to settle. That night, the wind howled around our little cabin, and it sounded like a man laughing. That night, my mother didn't sleep. She sat in the chair by the window, the iron poker across her lap, watching the darkness. Every gust of wind, every skittering sound of a night creature was him, Caleb. She imagined him out there, in the shadows, watching, waiting. The food in the pantry felt like a poison apple, a beautiful trap waiting to be sprung. She was right to be afraid. Just before dawn, she saw him, a fleeting shape moving at the edge of the woods that bordered our property, a man's silhouette against the graying sky. He was there for only a moment, and then he was gone. But he had been there. He was watching. He was letting her know she wasn't safe. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She couldn't go to the sheriff. Her story was too wild. A drifter from a decade ago, a wooden bird, a ghost story. Sheriff Miller would dismiss her. The town already thought the worst of her. They would say she was hysterical, making things up to cover her own guilt. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her first instinct was to run, to pack a bag, take me, and disappear into the night. But where would they go? They had no money, no family to take them in. They would starve on the road. Running was a death sentence. No, this was her home. My father had built this cabin with his own two hands. She wouldn't be scared away by a shadow. She had to fight. The next morning brought a new terror. On the front step sat a small wooden crate. My mother's heart stopped. She approached it cautiously, as if it were a snake. She nudged it open with the toe of her boot. Inside, nestled on a bed of straw, were 3 small bottles of medicine, a cough syrup, the expensive kind from the catalog, the kind they couldn't possibly afford. And resting on top of the bottles was another carved bird. This one was different. Its wings were spread, as if in mid-flight. The message was clear. I know your son is sick. I can get to your doorstep. I can get inside whenever I want. I am in control. This wasn't a threat of violence. It was worse. It was psychological torture. He was toying with her, pulling her strings, enjoying her fear. He wanted her to feel helpless, to know that he held her life and my life in the palm of his hand. The medicine felt like a death threat. She grabbed the crate and threw it into the fireplace, watching the wood and the glass blacken and melt. She would not accept his gifts. She would not play his game. She looked at her hand, at the wedding ring my father had given her. Thomas. He had been a deputy before he settled down to farm. He was a quiet man, but he was steady. He knew how to read people, how to see the truth beneath the lies. What would Thomas do? He wouldn't hide. He would face the threat head on, and he would find the truth. And then she remembered something, a conversation she'd had with my father years ago, late one night. They had been talking about the Blackwoods. My father had known Silas, not well, but they had served on a town committee together once. He said Silas was a hard man to read, closed off, and he mentioned the sister, Lily. He'd said the official story was a fever, but he'd heard whispers of something else, something about an accident in the barn. An accident. Martha had said Caleb claimed Silas pushed her. The town had dismissed it as the ramblings of a jealous, grief-stricken boy. But what if it wasn't? A new terrible thought began to take root in my mother's mind. What if Caleb wasn't the only monster in this story? What if his grudge wasn't based on a lie? She thought back to Silas's face when she'd offered him the ring. The coldness, the flat, immediate rejection. She had seen it as cruelty. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe looking at a desperate, grieving woman reminded him of his own past. Maybe her pain was a mirror for his own guilt. The silence, the isolation, the hard shell he had built around himself. Were they the walls of a lonely man or the fortress of a guilty one? She had to know the truth. The whole truth. She went back to Martha. This time she didn't bother with small talk. She sat across from the old woman, her eyes locked on hers. Martha, you have to tell me what really happened to Lily Blackwood. You were her mother's friend. You knew them. Tell me the truth. Martha's hands began to tremble. She put her sewing aside. That's old business, Alara. Buried and gone. It's not gone, my mother insisted, her voice low and urgent. It's back, and it's trying to destroy me and my son. I need to know. The old woman looked at my mother's face, at the desperation etched there. She let out a long, shaky sigh. The fever was real, she began. Lily was always frail, but that's not what took her, not directly. She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. There was a fall from the hayloft in their barn. Silas was there. He was the only one. He came running to the house carrying her, said she slipped, but her arm was broken and she'd hit her head. The fall weakened her, see? The fever came on fast after that. She was gone in 2 days. And Caleb? My mother asked, her heart pounding. Caleb showed up, drunk and raving, Martha said, shaking her head at the memory. He accused Silas to his face, said they'd been arguing, said Silas pushed her because he found out Lily was planning to run away with him. The sheriff looked into it, but there were no other witnesses. It was Silas's word against the drifters. The town believed Silas. It was easier to believe Silas. My mother felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. An accident, a fight, a push. It was a story with 2 sides, and for 10 years everyone had only listened to one. The whole narrative of her situation shifted. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a potential victim of Caleb's revenge. He was a man with a dark secret. The stolen supplies, the report to the sheriff. Was it possible he had lied? Not to help her, but to set a trap for Caleb? To have a reason, a clean and simple reason, to have him arrested the moment he showed his face in town again? She was caught in the middle of a decade-old feud, a fight over a dead girl, and she was starting to believe that neither of the men involved was innocent. She had a choice to make: run and hope Caleb didn't follow, or walk into the heart of the storm and force the truth into the light. She looked toward the Blackwood Ranch, its silhouette dark against the setting sun. The barn stood there, a silent witness. That was where the story began, and that was where it had to end. My mother didn't wait for darkness. She knew Caleb would come for Silas eventually, and she couldn't risk him getting there first. She walked back to the Blackwood Ranch, but this time she didn't go to the house. She went straight to the barn. The big doors were slightly ajar, a slice of darkness within. She slipped inside. The air was thick with the smell of hay and old wood. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light slanting down from the high windows. High above the hayloft was a platform of shadows, a stage where a tragedy had played out 10 years ago. And he was there. Silas Blackwood was standing in the middle of the barn, staring up at the loft. He wasn't working. He wasn't mending or building. He was just remembering. His broad shoulders were slumped, and in that moment, he didn't look like an imposing cattleman. He looked like a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. He heard her footsteps on the dirt floor and turned. His face hardened when he saw her, the familiar mask of indifference sliding back into place. "I told you not to come on my land again." "You need to tell me what happened to Lily," my mother said, her voice quiet but firm. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. The truth, all of it. Silas flinched, as if she had struck him. "That's none of your business." "A man named Caleb is terrorizing me and my son," she said, her voice rising. "He's leaving threats on my doorstep. He stole from you to frame me. This started here, in this barn. It is my business now. I deserve to know whose war I'm caught in." He stared at her, his jaw working silently. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. She thought he would throw her out again. But then, something inside him seemed to break. The hardness in his eyes cracked, revealing a deep, ancient well of pain. "He was hurting her," Silas said, his voice a rough, broken whisper. He was no longer looking at my mother, but up at the loft. "Caleb, he had a sweet tongue, but his hands were mean. I saw a bruise on her arm once. She lied, said she'd walked into a door. But I knew." He took a ragged breath. "I told her to stay away from him. I forbade her from seeing him. We were up there." He gestured to the loft, arguing. She was crying. She said she loved him, that I didn't understand. She said she was going to run away with him. His voice dropped so low it was almost inaudible. "I told her I'd rather see her dead than with him." A terrible, awful thing to say. She took a step back from me. Her heel caught on a loose board. I reached for her, but I was too slow. She just fell. He finally looked at my mother, his eyes swimming with a decade of unshed tears. "It was an accident, but it was my fault. The things I said, the fight. If I hadn't pushed her away, she wouldn't have stepped back. Caleb's lie was easier for me to bear than the truth. The truth is, I failed to protect her, from him, and from myself." It was a confession, raw and agonizing. The truth wasn't murder. It was something more complicated. It was guilt, the profound, unending guilt of a brother who felt he had caused his sister's death. As the last of his words faded into the dusty air, a new voice spoke from the barn doorway. "Telling ghost stories, Blackwood?" Caleb stood there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. He held a rusty lantern in one hand and a long, wicked-looking knife in the other. He was smiling, a cruel, twisted grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard everything," he said, stepping into the barn, letting the heavy door swing shut behind him, plunging the space into shadow. "Always knew you were a coward, blaming yourself when you should be blaming me." He laughed, a chilling, unhinged sound. "But now it's about everything. It's about your precious reputation, and hers." Silas moved, putting himself between Caleb and my mother. It was a protective gesture, instinctive and absolute. "This is between you and me, Caleb. Let her go." "Oh, I don't think so," Caleb sneered. "She's the star of the show, the poor, grieving widow. The whole town is just waiting to hear the end of her story, and I'm going to give it to them. A real tragedy. Two lovers, a widow and a murderer, caught in a fire. A real poetic ending. He wasn't just here for revenge. He was insane. Before anyone could react, he lifted the lantern. With a flick of his wrist, he threw it, not at them, but into the hayloft. The glass shattered. The oil exploded. The dry, ancient hay went up in a whoosh of orange flame. The fire was instant and ravenous. Flames licked up the wooden beams, roaring as they consumed the dry tinder of the loft. Smoke, thick and black, billowed down, choking the air. The heat was like a physical blow. The barn was turning into a furnace. "Get out!" Silas yelled at my mother, shoving her toward a small side door she hadn't noticed before. "Go, now!" But she didn't run. Her feet felt rooted to the ground. Caleb was advancing on Silas, the firelight glinting off his knife, his face a mask of triumphant madness. She saw him lunge, and in that moment, something my father taught her, something about leverage, about using an enemy's weight against them, flashed in her mind. She grabbed a heavy, long-handled pitchfork that was leaning against a stall. It was clumsy and heavy in her hands. Caleb was focused entirely on Silas, raising his knife for a killing blow. My mother didn't try to swing the pitchfork like a weapon. She dropped the end to the ground and pushed, aiming the tines low. Caleb didn't see it coming. The prongs caught his ankles, and his own momentum did the rest. He tumbled forward, letting out a cry of rage and surprise, and crashed headlong into a stack of old rain barrels. The barrels toppled like dominoes, one of them landing heavily across his legs, pinning him to the ground. He screamed, a sound of fury and pain. The fire was roaring now, a living beast. A heavy beam from the loft, burning and black, crashed to the floor just feet from where they stood. The whole structure was groaning, preparing to collapse. Silas was free. He looked at Caleb, trapped and screaming under the barrel. His face was a terrible thing to see in the flickering firelight. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was it. The man who had slandered his name, who had hurt his sister, who had tormented a helpless widow, was about to be consumed by fire. It wasn't murder. It was justice, providence. He could just walk away, leave him to burn. My mother saw the choice in his eyes. She saw 10 years of bitterness and rage warring with the decency buried deep inside him. "Silas!" she shouted over the roar of the flames. "We don't leave him." Her voice cut through his haze of hatred. He looked from Caleb to her, his expression confused. "We are not him," she said, her voice clear and strong. It was as if her words were a bucket of cold water. The vengeance drained from his face, replaced by a grim resolve. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Together they struggled with the heavy barrel. The heat was scorching their skin, the smoke tearing at their lungs. Caleb cursed and fought them, still trying to slash at them with his knife. They finally rolled the barrel off him. Silas grabbed the front of Caleb's shirt and began to drag him, limp and sputtering, toward the side door. They burst out into the clean, cool air just as a deafening groan came from behind them. With a sound like thunder, the entire roof of the barn caved in, sending a fountain of sparks and embers high into the sky. They lay on the ground, coughing, gasping for air, their faces black with soot. In the distance, they could hear shouting. The whole town had seen the smoke. Help was coming. Caleb lay between them, his leg clearly broken, the fight gone out of him. The fire, the fall, the capture, it had all broken him. When Sheriff Miller and a dozen other men arrived, they found a scene of unbelievable carnage. A burning barn and 3 figures covered in soot. Caleb, seeing the sheriff's star, began to babble. He confessed everything. Stealing from Silas, planting the food, the carved birds, the medicine. He even admitted, through sobs of pain and self-pity, that he had lied about Lily's death all those years ago. He had made it up to hurt Silas, to make him suffer. The truth, all of it, came out right there, in the yard, illuminated by the dying flames of the barn. The town was silent. They looked at my mother, not with suspicion, but with a dawning respect. She wasn't a fallen woman. She was a survivor. They looked at Silas, not as a cold-hearted recluse, but as a man who had carried a terrible burden in silence for a decade. The whispers and the judgments of the past few weeks turned to ash and blew away on the wind. A few days later, after the dust had settled, both literally and figuratively, Silas Blackwood came to our cabin. He knocked on the door, a sound that was hesitant and unfamiliar. He held his hat in his hands, looking as uncomfortable as a bear in a church pew. He wasn't carrying a sack of flour. He was holding a small, beautifully made wooden box. It was polished smooth, the grain of the wood warm and rich. "This is for you," he said, holding it out to my mother. She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. She opened the lid. Inside, the box was lined with dark blue velvet, with a single slot carved into the lining, a slot perfectly shaped to hold a ring. "My sister Lily," Silas said, his voice quiet. "She used to make these. She was clever with her hands." He looked at my mother's hand, at the simple gold band on her finger. "When you came to me, when you offered me your ring, I couldn't take it." He finally met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw not coldness, not guilt, but a profound and gentle sorrow. "A ring like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It represents a life, a promise. It's not something to be traded for flour and beans. It reminded me too much of all the things I'd lost. My sister, the life I could have had." The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. His silent shake of the head hadn't been a rejection of her. It had been a rejection of the transaction. It wasn't, "No, I won't help you." It was, "No, I will not take that from you." My mother was speechless. She looked from the box to his face, understanding dawning in her eyes. But one question remained. "The pantry, Silas," she said softly. "If Caleb stole your supplies to frame me, and you didn't do it, then who did?" A strange expression crossed Silas's face. He looked away, down the road toward the center of town, toward Gable's Mercantile. "The flour sacks," he said. "Check them again. Not for birds this time. Look at the bottom corner, for a maker's mark." My mother rushed to the pantry. She pulled out the remaining sack of flour. She turned it over and over, brushing away the dust. And there it was, faded, almost invisible, but still there. A small, stamped G inside a circle. Gable's Mercantile. Mr. Gable. The man with the face like a clenched fist. The man who had publicly refused her credit. He had seen her desperation, and his pride wouldn't let him offer charity to her face. But his conscience wouldn't let her starve. He must have filled her pantry in the dead of night, using the news of Silas's robbery as the perfect cover. No one would ever suspect him. He had done a profoundly kind thing and taken pains to ensure he would never get the credit for it. The next Sunday, the whole town came together, not for a sermon, but for a barn raising. They descended on the Blackwood Ranch with hammers and saws and sweat. Mr. Gable was there, working alongside Silas, never once mentioning the pantry, a silent understanding passing between the two men. The women of the town brought food for the workers, and they brought food for my mother, leaving it on her doorstep with quiet apologies and averted eyes. Mrs. Gable gave her a hug and whispered, "I'm so sorry." I was getting better. My cough was almost gone. I sat on our porch, watching the new frame of the barn rise against the blue sky. I saw my mother talking with Silas. They weren't smiling, not yet. It was too soon for that. But they were standing together, two lonely people who had found a strange sort of solace in a shared ordeal. She touched the wedding ring on her finger. She hadn't lost my father's memory. She had honored it. She hadn't traded her past for a sack of flour. She had fought for it, and in doing so, had built a future. True kindness, I learned then, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's silent, sometimes it's gruff, and sometimes it's hidden in the last place you would ever think to look. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe.